My name is Amelia. I'm 24 years old and I grew up in Washington, D.C. If someone had looked at my life from the outside, they would have said I had everything a young woman could want. I had a decent apartment, a steady job, good friends, and pictures on social media that made it seem like I was living my best life. But what nobody knew was that every single night I would lock my apartment door, slide down against it, and cry until I couldn't breathe. And one night, I whispered 7 words that completely changed my life. God, if you're real, please help me. That one cry became the beginning of my recovery. I never imagined that God could hear someone like me, but he did. And if you're watching this because you feel broken, hopeless, or beyond saving, I want you to stay with me. Because my story isn't about how strong I was, it's about how faithful God remained when I had absolutely nothing left. I was born and raised in Washington, D.C., in a quiet neighborhood where everyone seemed to know everyone. My parents worked hard, my dad drove for a delivery company, and my mom worked long shifts as a nurse. We weren't rich, but we never went hungry. Sunday mornings were different in our house. Mom always woke me up early. Amelia, she'd say with a smile, church starts in an hour. I'd groan, pull the blanket over my head, and complain that I was too tired. She'd laugh anyway. Looking back now, I realize those mornings were some of the safest moments of my childhood. The smell of pancakes, Dad humming old gospel songs while making coffee, Mom ironing my dress. Simple moments. Mom always carried her Bible everywhere. It looked worn out. The pages were filled with notes, highlighted verses, and tiny prayers written in the margins. One day when I was about 10, I asked her why she never bought a new Bible. She smiled. This one already knows my tears. I didn't understand what she meant. Not then. As I grew older, life slowly became more complicated. Middle school was where everything started changing. Kids could be cruel over the smallest things. I wasn't the prettiest girl. I wasn't the most popular. I was shy, awkward, and always worried about saying the wrong thing. One afternoon, I overheard 2 girls laughing behind me. She acts like she's invisible. Maybe because nobody notices her. They probably forgot those words within minutes. I carried them for years. That was the first time I remember believing the lie that I wasn't enough. Not pretty enough, not smart enough, not interesting enough. Those lies became the soundtrack inside my head. By high school, social media had become everything. Every photo, every like, every comment, every comparison. I spent hours scrolling through perfect lives, perfect vacations, perfect relationships, perfect smiles. Meanwhile, I stood in front of my mirror picking apart everything I hated about myself. My hair, my skin, my body, my smile. Nothing ever felt good enough. The more I compared myself to everyone else, the more I disappeared inside my own mind. My parents noticed something was changing. Mom would ask, "Are you okay?" I'd smile, "I'm fine." Dad would ask if I wanted to talk. "I'm just tired." I became really good at pretending. That's the dangerous thing about pain. Sometimes the people who smile the biggest are hurting the most. After graduating high school, I was accepted into a college just outside Washington, D.C. Everyone celebrated. My parents cried happy tears. They believed my future was finally beginning. I believed that changing my surroundings would change me. I was wrong, because you can't outrun what's happening inside your heart. College gave me freedom, but it also gave me loneliness. I lived away from home. I barely attended church anymore. Sunday became just another day to sleep late. At first, I told myself I'd go next week, then next month. Eventually, I stopped thinking about God altogether. Not because I hated him. I just didn't think he had anything to do with my life anymore. College was exciting in the beginning. New people, new experiences, late-night conversations, coffee shops, football games, study groups. Everything looked like the movies. Until real life arrived, classes became harder, bills started piling up, the pressure to succeed felt overwhelming. Everyone around me seemed confident. Meanwhile, I felt like I was constantly pretending to have my life together. Every test felt like my future depended on it. Every mistake convinced me I was a failure. During my second year, I met Edward. He wasn't loud. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He worked part-time at the campus library. The first time we spoke, I accidentally dropped an entire stack of books. I felt my face turn bright red. "I'm so sorry," I said. He smiled. "Good thing books don't get embarrassed." I laughed for the first time in weeks. That simple moment stayed with me. Edward wasn't like most people. He actually listened. He never interrupted. He remembered little details. If I mentioned I had an important exam, he'd ask about it days later. If I looked exhausted, he'd notice before anyone else did. For a while, I thought maybe life was finally getting better. But pain doesn't disappear just because someone is kind to you. I never told Edward what was really happening inside my head. I didn't tell anyone. Instead, I became even better at pretending. I smiled during conversations. I joked with classmates. I posted happy pictures online. Then I'd go back to my apartment, close the curtains, and sit alone in complete silence. Sometimes I wouldn't even turn on the lights. Darkness somehow matched how I felt inside. One evening, my mom called. "Sweetheart, we missed you at church again." "I've just been busy." There was a long pause. Then she quietly said, "Busy isn't always the same as okay." I felt tears forming immediately, but I forced myself to sound cheerful. "I promise I'm fine." She didn't argue. She simply said, "I've been praying for you every day." After we hung up, I stared at my phone for several minutes. I almost called her back. I almost told her everything. How I felt empty, how I cried almost every night, how I couldn't remember the last time I actually felt happy. But I didn't. I convinced myself that nobody needed to carry my problems, so I carried them alone. The months passed, and something inside me kept getting heavier. It wasn't just sadness anymore, it was exhaustion. The kind that sleep couldn't fix. Getting out of bed became a battle. Taking a shower felt like climbing a mountain. Answering text messages felt impossible. Some mornings I'd sit on the edge of my bed for nearly an hour, trying to find one reason to get dressed. I couldn't explain why. I only knew that I was slowly disappearing. And the scariest part was that no one seemed to notice. Not yet. I had no idea that the darkest season of my life was only beginning. Within a few months, one unexpected phone call would shatter everything I thought I could still hold together, and it would push me closer to the moment when my only remaining words would be a desperate cry to God. The phone call came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I remember every detail because it was one of those moments that divides your life into before and after. I had just finished a long class and was walking across campus with my headphones on when my phone started vibrating. It was my mom. I smiled as I answered, "Hi, Mom." But instead of hearing her cheerful voice, I heard crying. For a second, I couldn't even recognize it. Then she spoke. "Amelia, it's your dad." My heart stopped. What happened? He collapsed at work. The world around me suddenly felt silent. People were walking past me, cars were driving by, someone nearby was laughing, yet it all sounded miles away. Is he okay? There was another pause. They're taking him to the hospital. I don't even remember getting into my car. I only remember praying for the first time in months. God, please don't let him die. I repeated those words over and over during the drive to Washington, D.C. When I arrived, my mom was sitting in the hospital waiting room. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were swollen from crying. The moment she saw me, she stood up and hugged me tighter than she ever had before. "We're still waiting." Those 3 words felt heavier than anything else. Waiting. Waiting for doctors. Waiting for answers. Waiting to know whether life would ever feel normal again. Hours later, the doctor finally came out. Dad had suffered a serious heart attack. By God's mercy, he had survived. But his recovery would take months. The doctor explained everything carefully: stress, long working hours, physical exhaustion, medication, lifestyle changes. I nodded as if I understood. Inside, I was terrified. For the first time in my life, I realized my parents weren't invincible. Dad eventually came home. He smiled whenever I visited. He joked with everyone. He thanked God for giving him another chance. But I noticed something different. He walked slower. He tired more easily. Sometimes I'd catch him quietly staring out the window, as though he knew life had become more fragile. Seeing him like that broke something inside me. I wanted to help my family, so I started working more hours while finishing school. At first, it seemed manageable. Classes during the day, coffee after coffee, assignments late at night, work on weekends, sleep whenever I could. I kept telling myself this is only temporary. But temporary slowly became permanent. The pressure kept building: bills, tuition, helping my parents, trying to maintain good grades, trying to keep smiling, trying to convince everyone I was okay. The word trying became my entire life. One evening, Edward found me sitting alone outside the library. I hadn't realized tears were running down my face until he quietly sat beside me. Neither of us spoke for almost a minute. Finally, he asked, "Do you want advice, or do you just want someone to listen?" That question caught me off guard. Nobody had ever asked me that before. I wiped my face. "I don't even know." He nodded. "That's okay." We sat there watching the rain fall. Sometimes silence says more than words ever can. Edward wasn't particularly religious, at least not in the way I remembered from church, but he had something I admired: peace. Not perfect peace, just steadiness. When everything around him became stressful, he didn't panic. I couldn't understand it. Meanwhile, I felt like I was drowning every single day. Graduation finally arrived. Everyone was celebrating. Families filled the auditorium. People were taking pictures, throwing graduation caps into the air, laughing, planning their futures. I smiled for the photographs. Inside, I felt completely empty. I thought graduation would magically solve everything. Instead, adulthood introduced a whole new list of worries. Finding a job, paying rent, student loans, insurance, groceries. Life suddenly came with a price tag attached to everything. A few weeks later, I accepted an entry-level marketing position at a company downtown. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid enough to survive. The office looked modern, bright lights, glass walls, friendly coworkers. Everyone seemed ambitious, confident, successful. I wanted to fit in, so I worked harder than everyone else. If someone needed help, I volunteered. If overtime was available, I stayed. If another project appeared, I accepted it. I believed that if I worked hard enough, I'd finally feel valuable. Instead, I became exhausted. Months passed. Then something strange started happening. I couldn't sleep. Some nights I'd lie awake until 3 or 4 in the morning. Other nights I'd finally fall asleep, only to wake up an hour later with my heart racing. Doctors called it stress. They suggested improving my sleep schedule, drinking less coffee, exercising, meditating. I tried. Nothing changed. Because my real problem wasn't physical. It was the storm inside my mind. Soon, anxiety became part of my daily routine. I'd wake up already feeling afraid. Afraid of making mistakes, afraid of disappointing people, afraid of losing my job, afraid that something terrible was about to happen. Even when nothing was wrong, I couldn't explain it. I only knew I couldn't make it stop. One Friday evening, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror. I looked like a completely different person. Dark circles under my eyes, pale skin, hair pulled into a messy bun. I barely recognized myself. I whispered, "What happened to you?" There was no answer, only silence. To escape how I felt, I started filling every empty moment. Music, television, scrolling endlessly through social media, podcasts, videos, anything to avoid sitting alone with my thoughts. Because whenever the room became quiet, my mind became unbearably loud. It reminded me of every mistake, every regret, every fear, every insecurity. It never stopped. Mom kept calling. Every conversation ended the same way. "Have you been praying?" "I've just been busy." "I've been praying for you." I know. She never pressured me. She simply loved me. Looking back, I think her prayers reached heaven long before my own ever did. One Sunday afternoon, Edward invited me to grab coffee. We talked for almost 2 hours. Before leaving, he hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Were you raised in church?" I looked surprised. "How did you know?" "You mention your mom praying a lot." I smiled. "Yeah, when I was younger." He nodded thoughtfully. "My grandmother always used to say something." "What?" "Running from God doesn't make him stop looking for you." I laughed politely, but those words stayed with me all week. Running from God. Was that what I was doing? I didn't hate God. I simply believed he had forgotten me. Or maybe I had forgotten him first. A few weeks later, my life took another turn. The company announced budget cuts. Rumors spread through every department. People whispered in hallways. Managers held closed-door meetings. Nobody knew who would lose their job. Every morning I walked into the office wondering if that would be my last day. My anxiety became unbearable. I stopped eating properly. Coffee replaced breakfast. Sometimes lunch too. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling until sunrise. One morning, while trying to give a presentation, my hands started shaking so badly that I couldn't hold the remote. My breathing became fast. The room spun. My vision blurred. I thought I was having a heart attack, just like my father had. Instead, I collapsed in front of everyone. The ambulance arrived within minutes. But what the doctors told me in the emergency room shocked me even more than the collapse itself. It wasn't a heart attack, the physician said gently. Amelia, you experienced a severe panic attack. I stared at him in disbelief. If this was only panic, then why did it feel like my whole life was falling apart? I had no idea that this would only be the beginning of the darkest battle I had ever faced, a battle that would strip away every illusion of control and leave me desperate for a hope I could no longer find on my own. The doctor looked at me with kindness I didn't think I deserved. Amelia, your heart is healthy. I stared back at him, confused. But I couldn't breathe. I know. My chest hurt. I know. I thought I was dying. He nodded. That's exactly what a severe panic attack can feel like. The words didn't comfort me. If anything, they frightened me even more. How could my own mind make my body believe it was dying? Before I left the hospital, he encouraged me to see a therapist and reduce the amount of stress in my life. Reduce stress. I almost laughed. I didn't know how. Stress had become part of who I was. The following Monday, I returned to work pretending nothing had happened. Some coworkers smiled sympathetically. Others avoided mentioning it altogether. I appreciated both. I didn't want to explain what I couldn't even understand myself. For a few days, things seemed normal. Then another panic attack came. This one happened in the office elevator. It was crowded, the doors closed. Suddenly, the walls felt as if they were moving closer. My breathing became shallow. My hands started trembling. I couldn't get enough air. The elevator stopped on the 10th floor, and I rushed out before the doors had fully opened. I leaned against the hallway wall, shaking uncontrollably. I felt embarrassed, ashamed, broken. That evening, Edward called me. I heard what happened. I'm fine. There it was again, those two words, I'm fine. He stayed quiet for a moment. Then he gently asked, Amelia, when was the last time you were actually fine? I opened my mouth to answer. Nothing came out. Because I couldn't remember. Days turned into weeks. I started canceling plans with friends. I ignored phone calls. I stopped replying to messages. People assumed I was just busy. The truth was much darker. I didn't have the energy to pretend anymore. My apartment slowly reflected what was happening inside me. Laundry piled up. Dirty dishes filled the sink. Mail collected by the front door. The curtains stayed closed all day. Sometimes I wouldn't leave the apartment unless I absolutely had to. I told myself I simply needed rest. But deep down, I knew I was hiding. One Saturday afternoon, my mom surprised me. She knocked on my apartment door. When I opened it, I immediately wished I hadn't. She looked past me into the apartment. For just a second, sadness crossed her face. Not judgment, sadness. My sweet girl. She stepped inside without saying another word. Instead of criticizing me, she quietly began washing dishes. She folded laundry. She opened the curtains. Sunlight filled the room for the first time in days. I sat on the couch, feeling completely ashamed. Finally, I whispered, I'm sorry. She looked at me. For what? For becoming this. She walked over and held my face in both of her hands. You are not your struggle. That sentence broke something inside me. I buried my face against her shoulder and cried harder than I had in years. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer quick solutions. She simply stayed. Sometimes love doesn't speak. Sometimes it just refuses to leave. Before she went home, Mom picked up her old Bible from her purse, the same worn Bible from my childhood. She smiled softly. I don't want to force you. I nodded. But could I leave this here? I looked at it. Its cover was faded. The pages were worn from years of use. I remembered asking her years ago why she never replaced it. This one already knows my tears. Those words suddenly came back to me. I accepted the Bible and placed it on my coffee table. After she left, I didn't open it. Not that day. Not the next. It simply sat there collecting dust beside unopened mail. Life continued falling apart. One morning, my manager asked me to come into his office. My stomach immediately tightened. He folded his hands on the desk. Amelia, you've always worked hard. I knew what was coming. But lately you've missed deadlines. I stared at the floor. We're concerned about your health. I understand. We've tried to give you time. I know. He sighed deeply. Today has to be your last day. For a few seconds, I couldn't hear anything else. The words echoed over and over. Your last day. I packed my desk into a cardboard box while trying not to cry. Family photos, a coffee mug, a notebook, a tiny plant that I had forgotten to water. Everything that had represented my career now fit inside one small box. When I walked out of the building, I stood on the sidewalk watching everyone else rush to work. The city kept moving. Cars honked, people laughed, someone was walking a dog. The world hadn't stopped, only mine had. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Edward. I couldn't bear saying the words out loud. Losing my job felt like losing the last proof that I was capable of anything. Without work? Who was I? For weeks, I applied everywhere. Every application ended the same way. We've decided to move forward with another candidate. Each rejection chipped away at the little confidence I still had. Soon I stopped checking my email altogether. The nights became unbearable. Sleep refused to come. When it finally did, nightmares woke me. My thoughts became darker. Not because I wanted to die, but because I didn't know how to keep living like this. I remember sitting on my bedroom floor one night, hugging my knees. The apartment was completely silent. I whispered to myself, maybe everyone would be better off without me. The moment those words left my mouth, I froze. I couldn't believe I had actually said them. I started crying immediately. Deep down, I didn't want my life to end. I wanted the pain to end. There is a difference. But when you're drowning emotionally, it becomes difficult to see it. The next morning, Edward showed up unexpectedly. He held a paper bag. I brought breakfast. I'm not hungry. I wasn't asking. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. He walked into the apartment and quietly looked around. He noticed the unopened Bible on the table. "You still have it." "My mom left it." He nodded. "My grandmother used to say something else." I managed a weak smile. "What now?" "Sometimes God is quiet because he's waiting for us to stop running long enough to hear him." I looked away. I don't think God wants anything to do with me. Edward didn't argue. Instead, he asked, "Who told you that?" I had no answer, because the truth was, God never had. The voice telling me I was beyond hope had been inside my own head all along. That night after Edward left, the apartment felt painfully quiet again. Rain tapped gently against the windows. The clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop crying. My chest hurt. My mind was exhausted. As I walked through the dark apartment, my eyes fell on the old Bible still lying on the coffee table. For reasons I couldn't explain, I reached for it. My hands trembled as I brushed the dust from its cover. It slowly opened. Not because I knew where to turn, but because years of use had caused it to fall naturally to a page my mother had visited countless times. A single verse was underlined in faded blue ink. I stared at it through tear-filled eyes. I had no idea that the words on that page were about to become the first crack in the darkness surrounding my heart, and that before the next sunrise, I would utter one desperate cry to God that would begin changing everything. I sat there in complete silence. The rain continued tapping against the window. The only light in my apartment came from a small lamp beside the couch. I looked down at the open Bible resting in my lap. The page had naturally fallen open, as if it had been waiting for me all along. One verse was underlined in faded blue ink. It was Psalm 34:18. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." I read it once, then again, and again. Brokenhearted, crushed in spirit. For the first time in months, I felt like someone had put words to what I couldn't explain. I whispered, "That's me." Not successful, not strong, not confident, broken, completely broken. I don't know how long I sat there, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. I kept staring at those words. If God was really close to the brokenhearted, then where had he been? Why hadn't I felt him? Why hadn't he stopped everything that had happened? Questions filled my mind faster than answers ever could. I closed the Bible, placed it on the coffee table, walked into the kitchen, then turned around and picked it up again. Something wouldn't let me walk away. I started reading randomly, not because I understood scripture. Honestly, I barely remembered anything from church anymore. I simply kept turning pages. Some verses confused me, others didn't seem to relate to my life. Then I came across Matthew 11:28. "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Rest. That word almost made me cry. I couldn't remember the last time I had truly rested. Even when I slept, I woke up exhausted. Even when I smiled, I felt empty. Even when people told me I was doing well, I felt like a failure. I wasn't carrying one burden, I was carrying hundreds. Without realizing it, I started talking out loud. Not to myself. To God. At first it didn't sound like a prayer. It sounded like frustration. Where were you? My voice echoed through the apartment. I've been falling apart for months. Silence. I lost my job. Silence. I'm scared all the time. Silence. I don't know who I am anymore. The room remained completely still. For a moment I almost stopped. Then something inside me finally broke. I slid off the couch onto the floor. Tears poured down my face. My breathing became uneven. I wasn't trying to sound spiritual. I wasn't trying to say the right words. I had no beautiful prayer prepared. All I had was pain. And from the deepest place inside me, I cried, God, if you're still there, please help me. That was it. No long speech, no perfect words, just one desperate cry, one completely honest cry. I expected lightning, I expected some dramatic feeling, I expected something extraordinary. None of that happened. The room looked exactly the same. The rain continued falling, the clock continued ticking. Nothing around me had changed, but something inside me had. It wasn't that all my problems disappeared. It was much smaller than that, yet somehow much bigger. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't carrying everything alone. I couldn't explain it. I simply knew I wasn't completely abandoned. I stayed on the floor for a long time. Eventually, I wiped my face, opened the Bible again. This time, I wasn't searching for answers. I was simply reading. When I reached Isaiah 41 verse 10, I stopped. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. I smiled through tears. Help. That was the exact word I had cried out only minutes earlier. Was it a coincidence? Maybe someone else would say yes. But sitting there in my tiny apartment, it felt personal. It felt like God was gently reminding me, I'm still here. The next morning, something unusual happened. For months, I had dreaded waking up. That day, I opened my eyes and didn't immediately feel panic. The anxiety hadn't disappeared. The bills were still waiting. I still didn't have a job. Nothing in my circumstances had changed. But there was one tiny difference. I had hope, not confidence in myself. Hope in God. And hope, even the size of a mustard seed, can change the direction of a person's life. Later that afternoon, Edward called. How are you? I almost gave my usual answer, I'm fine. Instead, I said, I prayed. There was silence. Then he quietly asked, Really? I didn't even know what I was saying. What happened? I looked toward the Bible on my table. I cried. Another pause. I think that's sometimes the most honest prayer a person can pray. His words made me smile. That evening I called my mom. The moment she answered, I could hear the joy in her voice. Amelia? Hi, Mom. We talked for a few minutes about ordinary things. Then I interrupted. Mom? Yes? I opened your Bible. Silence. I prayed. I could hear her begin crying. Not loud, just quiet tears. After a few moments, she whispered, I've prayed for this day every single day. Those words shattered me. Every single day. While I had been running from God, my mother had been running toward him on my behalf. Over the next several days, I started reading the Bible every morning. Sometimes only 5 minutes, sometimes 20. I didn't understand everything. I still had questions. I still struggled with fear. But I noticed something surprising. Instead of reaching for my phone, the moment I woke up, I reached for Scripture. Instead of filling my mind with endless bad news, I filled it with God's promises. Slowly. Very slowly. My thoughts began changing. One Sunday morning, Mom invited me to church. My first instinct was to say no. What if people asked questions? What if they judged me? What if they saw how broken I really was? But another thought came to my mind. What if they didn't? So I went. Walking through those church doors felt strangely familiar. The smell of coffee in the lobby, children laughing in the hallway, people greeting one another with warm smiles. It reminded me of being a little girl holding my mother's hand. During worship, I couldn't sing. Every lyric caught in my throat. Then the pastor said something I'll never forget. God doesn't wait for people to clean themselves up before he welcomes them. Jesus meets us in our brokenness and begins the work of healing from there. I felt tears fill my eyes again, because for months I had believed I needed to fix myself before I could come back to God. But maybe, just maybe, healing didn't begin when I became strong. Maybe healing began the moment I admitted I wasn't. As the service ended, I remained seated while others began walking toward the exits. I closed my eyes and whispered another simple prayer. Jesus, I don't know what tomorrow looks like, but if you'll keep leading me, I'll keep following. I didn't realize it then, but that quiet decision would soon be tested in ways I never expected. Recovery had begun, but healing is rarely a straight path, and the greatest challenge to my new faith was waiting just around the corner. The Monday after I returned to church, I woke up expecting everything to feel different. It didn't. The bills were still sitting on my kitchen counter. My inbox still contained rejection emails. My apartment was still quiet. And for a brief moment, I felt disappointed. I had cried out to God. I had returned to church. Why wasn't everything suddenly better? As I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of coffee, I opened my Bible again. My eyes landed on Galatians 6:9. Let us not grow weary of doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. I read it 3 times. At the proper time. Not my time, God's time. That verse became my reminder that recovery wasn't a single moment. It was a journey of small, faithful steps. The next day, I finally did something I had been avoiding for months. I called the therapist whose number the doctor had given me after my panic attack. My finger hovered over the call button for almost 5 minutes. Part of me whispered, "You should be able to handle this on your own." But another voice, quieter and gentler, reminded me that asking for help wasn't weakness. When the receptionist answered, I nearly hung up. Instead, I took a deep breath. "My name is Amelia," I said. "I'd like to make an appointment." As soon as I ended the call, I cried. Not because I was afraid, because I had finally admitted that I needed help. My first therapy session was uncomfortable. The counselor asked simple questions. How long have you been feeling this way? When did the anxiety begin? What do you fear the most? At first I answered with short sentences. Then little by little, the walls I had built around my heart started to come down. For nearly an hour, I talked about things I had never spoken aloud. The pressure to be perfect, the fear of disappointing people, the constant comparison, the loneliness, the panic attacks, the shame. When the session ended, I felt emotionally exhausted, but strangely, lighter. For the first time, someone had listened without trying to fix me. That evening, I called my mom. "How was your appointment?" she asked. "It was hard, I know. I cried almost the whole time." She laughed softly. "Sometimes tears are part of healing," I smiled. "You always know what to say." "No," she replied gently. "I just know that God is patient with us." Over the next several weeks, I began building a new routine. Instead of checking social media the moment I woke up, I spent a few minutes reading scripture. Instead of carrying every worry alone, I started writing my prayers in a notebook. Some prayers were only 1 sentence long. "Jesus, help me today." Others filled entire pages. I wrote honestly. When I was angry, I told him. When I was afraid, I admitted it. When I felt hopeful, I thanked him. I stopped trying to impress God with perfect words. I simply spoke to him like a daughter speaking to her father. Edward noticed the difference before I did. One afternoon, we met at the same coffee shop where we had talked months earlier. "You look different," he said. I laughed. "I finally brushed my hair?" He smiled. "No." "What then? You look lighter." I looked down at my coffee. "I still have anxious days. I know. I still cry. I know. I still don't know what my future looks like," he nodded. "But now you have hope." I smiled. For the first time, I realized he was right. Hope hadn't removed my struggles. It had changed how I faced them. Not every day was easy. There were mornings when anxiety still woke me before the alarm. There were nights when fear whispered that nothing would ever change. There were Sundays when I questioned whether God was really working. But instead of running from him, I ran to him. That was the difference. One evening during Bible study, the pastor said something that stayed with me. "Faith doesn't mean you'll never feel afraid." He paused. "It means fear no longer gets the final word." I wrote that sentence in the front of my Bible. Whenever anxiety returned, I read it again. About 2 months later, something unexpected happened. I received an email inviting me to interview for a position at a nonprofit organization that helped families facing financial hardship. I almost ignored it. After so many rejections, I assumed this one would end the same way. Still, I prayed before the interview, not "God, give me this job." Instead, "God, your will be done." That prayer surprised even me. Months earlier, I had believed everything depended on me. Now I was slowly learning to trust God's direction, even when I couldn't see it. The interview felt different. The hiring manager asked about my previous experience. Then she asked, "What motivates you?" Months earlier, I would have talked about success, promotions, career goals. Instead, I answered honestly. I've learned that people matter more than titles. If my work can genuinely help someone, that's the kind of career I want. She smiled warmly. As I walked out of the building, I felt peaceful. Whether I got the job or not, I knew I had been honest. 3 days later, my phone rang. "We'd love to have you join our team." I closed my eyes. Tears filled them immediately. After hanging up, I did something I hadn't done in years. I knelt beside my bed. "Thank you, Lord." Not because I had finally found another job, but because I knew I hadn't walked there alone. When I told my parents, my dad smiled with tears in his eyes. He wrapped me in one of his long hugs and whispered, "I've been watching God rebuild you." Those words meant more to me than the job itself, because he wasn't celebrating my career. He was celebrating my healing. The new job wasn't perfect. There were stressful days, difficult conversations, tight deadlines, but something inside me had changed. When anxiety appeared, I didn't pretend it wasn't there. I prayed. I used the tools I had learned in therapy. I talked to trusted people instead of isolating myself. Little by little, I stopped believing the lie that asking for help was failure. I began to understand that God often brings healing through both His presence and the people He places in our lives. One Sunday after church, Edward and I walked through a nearby park. The trees were beginning to bloom, just as they had the spring before. "So," he asked with a grin, "do you remember telling me God wanted nothing to do with you?" I laughed softly. "I remember. What do you think now?" I looked up at the clear blue sky. "I think He was chasing me even when I thought I was running away." Edward smiled. "I think you're right." As we continued walking, I realized something beautiful. A year earlier, I had begged God simply to help me survive another day. Now, for the first time in a very long time, I was beginning to dream about the future again. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew the one who would walk beside me. And soon, I would discover that the greatest part of my testimony wasn't that God removed every struggle. It was that He transformed the frightened, hopeless woman I had become into someone who could finally say, with complete honesty, my recovery truly began with one cry to God. The final chapter of my story was still waiting to be written. Looking back now, it's hard to believe how much my life has changed. Not because everything became perfect. It didn't. I still have difficult days. There are mornings when anxiety tries to creep back into my thoughts. There are moments when fear whispers the same old lies. You're not enough. You're going to fail. Nothing has really changed. But now those voices are no longer the loudest ones I hear. God's voice has become louder. His promises have become stronger. And His presence has become more real than my fears. It's been almost 2 years since that rainy night when I fell to the floor of my apartment and cried, "God, if you're still there, please help me." Sometimes I go back to that apartment building in Washington, D.C. I park across the street and simply look at the window of the apartment where everything changed. From the outside, it looks ordinary. No one walking past would ever guess that inside that small apartment, a young woman who had completely lost hope discovered that God had never let go of her. That place reminds me that miracles don't always happen in crowded stadiums. Sometimes they happen on the living room floor, with tears running down your face and no words left except, "Help me." I still have my mother's old Bible. She finally laughed one day and said, I think it's yours now." I smiled. "No." She looked confused. "It's still yours." "Why?" "Because it still knows your tears." She hugged me and started crying. Then we both laughed through our tears. The Bible sits on my bedside table every night. Its pages are even more worn now. Not because I have all the answers, but because I finally know where to go with my questions. Dad's health has improved. He still takes his medication, he still goes to his checkups. But every Sunday morning, he stands in the kitchen making pancakes while humming old gospel songs. Just like he did when I was a little girl. Some things never change, and thank God for that. Mom still prays every day. One morning I asked her, "Did you ever think about giving up on me?" She looked almost offended. "Never." But I walked away from God. She gently held my hand. "I knew God could run faster than you." We both laughed. Then she added, "I wasn't praying because I was afraid God would stop loving you." She smiled through tears. I was praying because I knew he never would. Those words settled deep in my heart. Edward has remained one of my closest friends. People often ask him why he never gave up on me. His answer is always simple. Because someone once refused to give up on me. That's the beautiful thing about grace. When you've received it, you naturally want to give it away. His friendship reminded me that God often answers prayers through ordinary people who choose to stay when everyone else walks away. At my new job, I meet families who are carrying burdens that remind me of my own. Single mothers wondering how they'll pay rent, young people overwhelmed by anxiety, fathers trying to rebuild their lives after losing everything. Whenever appropriate, I share a small part of my story. Not to make myself the focus, but to remind them that hopelessness doesn't have to be the end. One afternoon, a young woman sat across from my desk with tears streaming down her face. She quietly whispered, "I think I'm broken." I reached across the table and gently said, "So did I." She looked at me in surprise. "I thought people like you had everything together." I smiled. "I thought that once too." Then I told her something I'll never forget. Broken things are not beyond God's reach. Sometimes they're exactly where His healing begins. I saw hope appear in her eyes, the same hope that had once appeared in mine. Recovery taught me something I wish I had learned years earlier. Healing isn't pretending the pain never happened. Healing is allowing God to walk with you through the pain until it no longer defines you. I used to think faith meant never struggling. Now I know faith means bringing every struggle to Jesus. I used to think crying showed weakness. Now I know some of the strongest prayers are spoken through tears. I used to think God loved the perfect version of me I was trying to become. Now I know He loved the broken version of me that cried out on the floor of a tiny apartment. His love came first. My healing came afterward. If you're listening to my story today, maybe you're wondering why it found you. Maybe your smile hides tears no one else sees. Maybe you're exhausted from pretending you're okay. Maybe anxiety has stolen your peace. Maybe you've convinced yourself that God has forgotten you. I believed those same lies. They were still lies. You may feel abandoned. You are not abandoned. You may feel unseen. God sees you. You may feel beyond saving. You are not beyond His grace. I can't promise that your problems will disappear overnight. Mine didn't. Recovery took time. Healing took patience. Some prayers were answered quickly. Others took months. A few are still unfolding. But through every season, God remained faithful. Sometimes people ask me, what was the turning point? They expect me to describe a spectacular miracle. A bright light, a dramatic vision, an audible voice from heaven. I simply smile. The turning point was one honest prayer. Not an eloquent prayer, not a perfect prayer, just an honest one. God, please help me. That cry didn't instantly change my circumstances. It changed the direction of my heart. And once my heart began turning toward God, everything else slowly began to follow. If I could sit across from the younger version of myself, the frightened 24-year-old girl sitting alone in that dark apartment, I know exactly what I would say. Hold on. This isn't the end. One day, you'll smile without pretending. One day, you'll sleep peacefully again. One day, you'll wake up with hope. And one day, you'll tell this story, not because your life was easy, but because God was faithful. I wish I could have seen that future, but maybe I wasn't supposed to. Because faith isn't seeing the whole road. It's trusting the one who walks beside you one step at a time. So today my testimony is simple. My name is Amelia. I'm from Washington, D.C. I lost my peace, I lost my confidence, I lost my job. For a while I even lost hope, but I was never beyond the reach of Jesus Christ. The night I finally stopped pretending to be strong was the night I discovered His strength was enough. My recovery didn't begin with a new job. It didn't begin with therapy alone, though therapy was an important part of my healing. It didn't begin when my circumstances improved. My recovery began with one cry to God. And if He could hear the broken whisper of a hopeless young woman on the floor of a tiny apartment in Washington, D.C., then He can hear your whisper too. No matter how dark your night feels, no matter how many mistakes you've made, no matter how far you think you've wandered, His arms are still open, His mercy is still new every morning, His grace is still greater than your deepest wounds. And sometimes, the most beautiful chapter of your life begins with the simplest prayer you will ever pray. Jesus, please help me.